Edward Said was born in Jerusalem, raised in Jerusalem and Cairo, and educated in the United States, where he attended Princeton and Harvard. In 1963, he began teaching at Columbia University, where he is currently University Professor of English and Comparative Literature. He is the author of more than 20 books, which have been translated into 35 languages, including Beginnings, Intention and Method, Orientalism, The Question of Palestine, Covering Islam, The World in the Text and the Critic, After the Last Sky, Music Elaborations, Culture and Imperialism, Representations of the Intellectual, The Reith Lectures, Peace and Its Discontents, Essays on Palestine and the Middle East Peace Process, Entre Guerre et Paix, and Out of Place, a memoir. In addition, he edited Henry James' Complete Stories, 1884 to 1891, for the Library of America. Besides his academic work, he writes a twice-monthly column for Al-Hayat and Al-Ahram, is a regular contributor to newspapers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Said is also the music critic for The Nation. He serves on the editorial board of 20 journals and is the general editor of a book series, Convergences, at Harvard University's Press. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Society of Literature, the American Philosophical Society, an honorary fellow of King's College, Cambridge, as well as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He has been awarded 16 honorary doctorates. He was a member of the Penn Executive Board until 1998 and president of the Modern Language Association in 1999. As a musician, he has collaborated with Daniel Barenboim and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in a new production of Beethoven's Fidelio, for which he wrote a new English text to replace the spoken dialogue. Additionally, he conducted workshops with Mr. Barenboim and Yo-Yo Ma for young Arab and Israeli musicians in Weimar, Germany. Through his involvement with Palestinian rights, he served as a member of the Palestine National Council from 1977 to 1991. His most recent publications include The End of the Peace Process, Oslo and After, Reflections on Exile and Other Essays, and Power, Politics, and Culture. And in 2002, his Parallels and Paradoxes, Explorations in Music and Society, a series of conversations between him and Daniel Barenboim, will be published by Pantheon. And now I'd like to present Professor Edward Said.
I'm very, very grateful to all of you for coming today. I mean, it's such a beautiful afternoon. I could think of better things to do with it than to sit in here, but I'm glad you're here. And I'm also extremely grateful to the Students for Free Palestine, which organized this talk, and especially Shireen Tawil, who persisted until she succeeded in breaking down my reticence, because I'm not well, and it's hard for me to do what I used to do. And Angela, who's going to help with, Angela Saud, who's going to help with the overhead projector. And also Professor Brian Fay, who very kindly accepted to moderate the program. So I'll begin straight away by saying that what I propose to present to you this afternoon is an effort at understanding, understanding, in my opinion, being a never-ending process of trying to take in as much as possible of the facts and the realities of a situation, its historical backgrounds and present actualities, and also as much as possible to be alive to the changes and dynamics of a situation which, as Vico taught us, never changes. Human beings make history, and history is always being made and therefore can be understood as a human product. Now, I want to say also that I can't, in this short talk, I can't really speak about everything, but I will try to place the Palestinian narrative before you and within a different framework than is normally the case. I'm not here to, as I'll be mentioning later, I'm not here to explain everything if I can. Now, I don't think I could. But I'm trying as much as possible to put forward a particular view of current events and to leave room for discussion and questioning, which I hope we'll have at the end. I think we must, as I say, deal with as many of the facts of the situation as possible, especially remembering, and I want this to be one of the keynotes of what I have to say, that we live in a time not of the clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington and his acolytes endlessly repeat, but rather, much more interestingly, the clash of interpretations of history and identity. That is to say, for all sorts of reasons which we can go into later, I think people are really very much involved in trying to understand their own past, their own identity, their own presence, and it's a battle of interpretations which goes on in our own country. I'll give you an example, a recent example, to explain what I mean telegraphically. You must know, or some of you must know, Arthur Schlesinger's book called The Disuniting of America, which appeared about 8 or 9 years ago, which is a kind of cri de coeur of a major American historian, lamenting the fact that American history seems to have become fragmented into all kinds of strands that were not there when American history consisted of the works of Henry Adams and Bancroft and the sort of white male historians who set the tone for American history in the earlier part of this century. And Schlesinger goes on to lament the incoherence that attends on such a fragmentation when you have, you have women's history, you have gay history, you have African American history, all of them, Asian American, Latino history, etc., all of them vying for the definition of what American history is. So on the one hand, you have the Arthur Schlesinger lamenting the situation, and then you have, on the other hand, the presentation of what he calls a people's history of the United States, namely the Howard Zinn book, which you must all know also, which is a tremendous bestseller, which tries to present American history, as it were, from below, in which America is really is an immigrant country, and many strands of its history are usually not represented or underrepresented or misrepresented in the majestic narrative that many of us grew up with. And for Zinn, it's really something not to be lamented, but rather to be celebrated, that one can discern these many strands. And I think this contest over identity and the past, let's call it the reclamation of the past, or the understanding or the recovery of memory, has characterized the late 20th century perhaps more deeply, I think, than any other time, partly because of the dissipation of the classical empires, the dislocations and migrations of peoples all over the world, the continuing processes of globalization, whether one likes it or not, have changed the mix so that, huge parts, for example, of Europe today, Sweden, for instance, is, no country could be more Swedish than Sweden, if you see what I mean. But in the last 15 years, Sweden has changed demographically so that there's now a 15% population of non-Swedes, Kurds and Arabs and Turks and others who have come into Sweden and changed the character of the country irrevocably. The same is true of Germany, which has, a large immigrant population. Germany is no longer German in quite the same way. The same is true of France, the second largest religion in France after Catholicism is Islam. Same is true of Italy. And of course, it's especially true of our country, which is, it bears repeating, I think, an immigrant society and always has been, and therefore is, constantly in a state of flux. So there is, I think, the battle over identity. Who is America? What is America? is very central to, I think, the present, and especially at a time like this when we're involved in a war that seems, according to the President and the Secretary of Defense and others, more or less everlasting war. I lament that, but that's perhaps another subject. But this kind of thing goes on everywhere. It's certainly true in the Islamic and Arab world, and it's especially true where it's been simplified and reduced as a place where there's been a lot of fundamentalism. Where isn't there fundamentalism? I mean, we have perhaps the largest fundamentalist population in the world in this country. Nobody ever talks about that. But to take a secular view of these things, I think one has to show that people are reverting to religion, not very simply, just as we're returning to Christianity or Islam, but to versions of Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and so on and so forth, many of them battling different interpretations of what that is. And that's especially true, I finally come to my subject, that's especially true of Palestine and Israel, which has got to be, I think almost without exception, the most deeply invested country or geography in the world today, so far as claims, counterclaims, histories, counter-histories, and changes have taken place there. More than, I think, more than anywhere else in the world, given that it's the origin of the three major, in many ways, the three major monotheistic religion. I often say when people ask about Palestine, I just say that the natural product of Palestine is religion. As other places manufacture cotton and transistors or whatever it is, computers, we manufacture sects and religion, which is not, I'm afraid, a very happy product on the whole. And there's been a great deal, usually kept out of the media, a great deal of searching, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side, as to the meaning of the past, what the past is, what of the past can be recovered and reclaimed, what needs to be looked at again. I mean, many of you have heard of the new Israeli historians who have emerged as an important force in the last 15 years or so, and their claim is that the standard story of narrative of Israel has to be looked at, given that the archives are now available, and the Palestinians are very much a contending party in that history, and a silenced party. And there's been an even deeper look at the antique past of Israel, of Palestine. I mean, there's a very important book which I discovered a few years ago called The Invention of Ancient Israel. It's part of a kind of revisionist group of archaeologists who are looking at the history of Israel from a point of view that includes the normally not looked at histories that were concurrent with that of the Hebrew Bible. And what they've uncovered is very, very interesting. Now, some of them are Israeli, some of them are English and American, some of them are French, German, etc., etc. But what they've discovered is that there's a model that we all assume. I've assumed it for a long time too, that somehow Palestine is the seat of ancient Israel, and that's the main history. There wasn't much else, but if you look at it very carefully, say in the period between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, which is the period of the Davidic Empire, 300 or 400 years, it emerges that Israelite history, and that's how it was referred to in the Old Testament, Israelite history, according to the light of recent archaeology, is one of many histories. Most of the others have been silenced, or simply we don't hear from them, because there is this understanding that the most important history was Israelite history, which ended up today in the modern state of Israel. The facts are much more complicated and, to me, much more interesting. There were many other histories in ancient Palestine: the Moabites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, and one of the tribes, which had ascendants for a period, but by no means the longest period, were the Israelites and the kingdom of David. But that was succeeded and coexisted not only with many other empires of the period, the Assyrian, the Egyptian, the Phoenician, the Nabatean, and so on, but also with many other civilizations that have come and gone, many of them lasting a great deal longer than the Israelite one. So it's wrong to think that Palestine has always been and is mainly the history of ancient Israel. It's much, much more. I think that's important to remember as one looks at the present, because there is such a terrible dispute going on there today between Israel as a state that was founded, as you know, in 1948, and the Palestinian people who contend differently about the past and about their own past. And it's really my purpose today to put forward a narrative view that I won't say is more important or more inclusive, certainly more inclusive, but it's not meant to be anything but complementing, restoring to sight another history, which I think, if you are to understand the conflict of the present, needs to be seen. Now, I would also argue, and I hope you will listen to what I have to say when I say it, that every long-standing and deeply invested political dispute can be seen as a contest between one side, which is mostly or largely in the wrong, and another side, which is mostly or largely in the right. Intellectual and moral responsibility requires us to make judgments of that sort if considerations of justice and peace are the core of the matter. And I want to say at the very beginning that my interest here is to put forward a Palestinian narrative and to account for the current situation, which isn't really completely understood unless you see this narrative in all of its force and richness, but also to say that it is imperative to see that narrative if we are to arrive at a state that can roughly be described as peace. In other words, I don't think it's possible, I'll say at the very outset, for one side militarily to defeat the other. I'm supported in this view by a headline in today's New York Times in which General Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, is described as not having gotten the security he promised his people. The fact is that Israel today is just as embattled as it was when he came to power a year ago, and that the likelihood, because of his policy of trying to crush Palestinians militarily, the likelihood is that it will not succeed any more than he succeeded in 1982 to destroy the Palestinians in Beirut. My argument is partly that Sharon is a born loser and he keeps repeating his mistakes, unfortunately. But I think that there is no military option either for the Arabs and the Palestinians on the one hand, if you want to talk about them together, or for the Israelis and their allies, principally the United States, on the other. I just think it's a stalemate that way, and that the only hope is to find a mode of coexistence for what is a land with two peoples in it, one Arab and Palestinian, Muslim and Christian, and the other Israeli Jewish for the most part, although there is, 20% of Israel's population is made up also of Palestinian Arabs who are not Jewish. Now, to say, as is often the case with liberal intellectuals, that both sides are right and wrong, or that there is merit in each case, or that one must be even-handed, or that the situation is tragic because it's a conflict between two rights, is simply to dodge the issue, as far as I'm concerned. It's also a form of moral cowardice. This is particularly true of the question of Palestine, which in the U.S. has either been thought of by liberals as tragic and unclear in its contest between two sides with equal justice, or much more often has been portrayed and talked about so misleadingly, has been misrepresented so grossly, has been so unjustly characterized and acted upon in the public realm and by the government, as to amount to something of extraordinary, indeed the most crying and scandalous one-sidedness. The Palestinian people has endured terrible injustice for decades now, and even as I speak, is undergoing horrendous collective punishment of the cruelest sort, all mostly unrecognized and labeled preposterously in the media by the U.S. government and by pro-Israeli organizations as justified retaliation for violence and terrorism. Most people forget that there has been a 35-year-old military occupation of Palestinian territory, which continues even as we speak. Nothing like this has even been remotely been the fate of the Israeli people. Why and how this grotesquely lopsided situation is what I want to talk about today. Although I want to repeat that the framework I speak in is that there is no military option, it's one land for two peoples, sharing and coexistence has to be the conclusion of this contest. I shall concentrate on, as I said earlier, an alternative narrative, because I believe not to do so is to ignore the facts and distort the truth, so far as the Palestinian people are concerned. There is an Israeli case, of course. Many of you know its main outlines, that Israel was founded as a country, it was the liberation movement of the Jewish people, it was established in 1948, Israel has wanted peace with the Arabs ever since, but it's forced to defend itself, it's been the victim of terrorism, it's had wars with the Arabs, which have been forced on Israel, and that Israel has been asking for peace and acceptability from the very beginning. As I say, I'm not here to make the case, nor to suggest that its merits outweigh its injustices to the Palestinian. But I do want to remind you that for every Palestinian today, and for every Arab, and for every Muslim in the world, we're talking about 1.3 billion people, Israel was created in 1948 on the ruins. Whatever else you may believe about it, that's fine. But the fact is that it was created on the ruins of the society of the Palestinian people, who were totally dispossessed within the space of a few months between 1947 and the spring of 1948, when Israel was officially declared as a state. And during that time, 2/3 of the Palestinian Arab population, which was the majority population of Palestine at the time, it's the country I was born in, and I spent my total of about 12 of my formative years there, in and out. There was a large majority of the population was Palestinian, and 2/3 of that population was forcibly expelled in 1948 during the war. In the process, over 400 villages were destroyed, and literally billions of dollars in property were also lost. Let me quote to you here a passage of a speech given by Moshe Dayan, who nobody ever accused of being pro-Palestinian, which he quite honestly gave as a great war hero, and so on, in April of 1969 to an Israeli audience. Please listen. "We came to this country," he said, "which was already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew, that is a Jewish state here. In considerable areas of the country, the total area was about 6%, we bought lands from the Arabs. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the name of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist," Dayan continued, "the Arab villages are not there either. Nahalal, which is Dayan's own village, arose in the place of Mahalul, Givat in the place of Jibta, Kibbutz Sarid in the place of Hanefs, and Kfar Yehoshua in the place of Tel Shaman. There is not," this is the last sentence, "there is not one place in this country that did not have a former Arab population." In 1967, Israel conquered the rest of Palestine. 22% of the rest of Palestine, which is 22% of the entire land area of Palestine. And since 1967 has built over 140 settlements on what is, without any question in historical and political terms, Palestinian land. These settlements continue to grow every day. There are now 400,000 settlers on Palestinian territory. I include here East Jerusalem, which was annexed and has been unrecognized by anybody except Israel. Even the United States doesn't recognize East Jerusalem as part of Israel. So we're talking about a new population of forcibly settled settlers in the areas of 1967. Since 1948, therefore, Palestinians have become an exiled people, with over 3.5 million refugees scattered around the world, mainly in the Arab countries, but also in this country, in Europe, the Arab world, and so on. And I'm giving you a breakdown of the population. 3.5 million refugees, 1 million Israeli citizens, who are roughly 18 to 20% of the population of Israel, and 2.5 to 3 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. That is to say, under Israel's military occupation, which is now the longest, please note this, the longest military occupation in modern history. It is equaled for the time being, although I think it now actually has passed the Japanese occupation of Korea, which began in 1910 and ended in 1945. So Israel's occupation is the longest in modern history and continues even as we speak. Compared to their Israeli antagonists, who are a redoubtable nuclear power, possess one of the largest, in fact, Israel has it is estimated somewhere between 300 and 500 nuclear warheads. And Israel possesses one of the largest and best endowed military machines on earth, largely because of unconditional U.S. munificence, to the tune of at least $5 billion per year in unrestricted aid. The Palestinians, by comparison, are a poor and relatively defenseless people. But for years and years, a systematically distorted picture of the realities has been, alas, disseminated about the Palestinians, so that it has become virtually impossible to see Palestinians as human beings, so dehumanized have they become, except as violent, suicidally bent terrorists whose whole purpose in life is to kill as many Jews as possible and in effect carry on the Hitlerian genocidal program for no other reason than the one Hitler had, i.e. to kill Jews for the sake of killing Jews. Lost is any sense of a Palestinian history or the existence of a Palestinian people on its land. There are now many, many books that document this by Palestinians and by others, or of a people more grievously and unjustly sinned against than almost any on earth, or of a whole array of international covenants and resolutions that protects the rights of the Palestinians. There's a whole library of international protocols, UN resolutions, declarations by the European Union, by the Organization of African States, the Islamic Conference. The whole world has said yes, and as recently as a few months ago, both President Bush and Secretary Powell and Prime Minister Blair has said, yes, the Palestinians are entitled to a state, and we hope that they'll get one someday. Nobody seems to do much about it. And this lost history has been covered by a movement and its information system that has always wanted more land for a Jewish state in Palestine and as few Arabs there as possible, despite the fact that it was and already still is populated by another people. From that simple yet irreducibly clear fact has stemmed not only the enormous tensions and distortions in the Middle East that have plagued its people since the middle years of the last century, but the continuing repression of the Palestinian people, who have suffered far, far more at Israel's hands than any Israelis have at their hands. There simply is no comparison. The sustained asymmetry between the two sides is more stunning than any in modern history. During the Intifada, for example, which began in October of the year 2000, the recent Intifada, over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed, and about 220 or 240 Israelis have been killed. 25,000 Palestinians have been wounded, and about 600 Israelis have been wounded. So the asymmetry is very, 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 very striking. During the past 16 months, as a massive anti-colonial rebellion or intifada has been occurring against Israeli occupation, what has the media in this country been giving us but a series of twisted ideological fictions designed not only to disguise but to obliterate the reality? I counted at one point how many in a period, I'm trying to remember exactly when I did this survey, it must have been about, maybe a year ago. I counted 100 newspaper articles in leading mainstream newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on and so forth. In 96 of them, there was no mention of the fact that the incidents and the violence and all the rest of it was occurring on occupied territory. In other words, the phrase occupied territory has simply passed out of existence, and what you get are headlines. More violence in Israel, with the impression that most of the violence is taking place in Israel, whereas in fact it isn't. It's taking place on the West Bank and Gaza. So the people have no idea that what has been going on is a rebellion against occupation and the oppression that goes with it, about which I'll speak in a minute. The media here speaks endlessly of Palestinian violence. There is scarce and extremely rare mention of the fact, however, that the Israeli army has been in military occupation of Palestinian land since 1967, and that an occupied people has the right of resistance according to every known protocol, whether the Geneva Conventions or the UN resolutions or the International Declaration of Human Rights. People under military occupation have the right of resistance, military or otherwise. The president, the media, and the Israelis speak of Palestinian terrorism, but no mention is made of the vast asymmetry in loss of lives that I mentioned a moment ago, and power between the two sides. This is not a battle between two sovereign states. This is a colonial assault by one state on a disenfranchised people, exactly like the armed attacks by colonial armies in Vietnam and Algeria against lightly armed civilian, mostly civilian resistance groups. In the past few days, as an example near at hand, Israeli helicopters, gunships, Apaches and Cobras supplied by the United States, tanks, Merkava tanks, and missiles were used to bomb the towns of Rafah, Khan Yunis, Ramallah, Jenin, Tul Karam, and Nablus. All of them civilian towns with no defenses, no artillery, no tanks, no air force to protect them. Last night I watched the NewsHour, and I watched the BBC, and both of them said Israeli warplanes, we're talking about F-16s. This is very reminiscent of Guernica, those of you who are old enough to remember the Spanish Civil War or have read about it. F-16s were used to attack, now listen to this, Palestinian security targets in Gaza. Now, and there were no pictures shown, so what this brings to the eyes or the ears of the beholder is an image of, precision bombing such as we see in the war in Kosovo or the war in the Gulf War or the war against Afghanistan. You see through the sights of a fighter bomber, and you see what seems like a very precise target, security targets. But if you know anything about the geography, about which I will speak in a minute, of the West Bank or Gaza, you'll know, especially the Gaza Strip, which is the most densely occupied bit of geography in the world, right? So the security targets means that even if a police station was hit or an office of the Palestinian Authority, since Israel has been targeting and trying to destroy the infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank and Gaza, that even if that is hit, every building around these very densely occupied and packed in places is affected, and many people are killed. 11 people were killed yesterday by these Israeli raids, which were supposed to be targeting security installations on the West Bank. So there's a tremendous amount of damage, about which I'll also speak in a minute. Why is so much destruction and so many casualties of civilians? As I said, many, many thousands since last October of 2000. Why are so many required by Israel? The official answer is that it's retaliation and self-defense. When you ask, where are the Palestinian helicopter and missile assaults, you are sent back with righteously windy harangues about terrorism and Israeli security without a word about military occupation, the siege of Palestinian towns and schools and hospitals by the Israeli military, all of it designed to punish and not, as a leading Israeli journalist said, that the Israeli military had openly conceded, not to prevent terrorism. In fact, the ex-head of military intelligence, Israeli military intelligence, Ayalon, said as recently as January, a month ago, that none of these measures, blockading people in their towns, making it impossible for Palestinians to move, has any effect on security, because the answer is, there's still people willing and able to infiltrate and to attack Israeli settlements and military outposts and so on and so forth. He said it's like trying to empty the sea with a spoon. It's about as effective as that. So it's just as the reservists, whose statement I will read in a minute, who have refused service have said it's just a way of humiliating and punishing an entire people to break their will, which, as we know from history, never works. The more you try to do that, the more resistance there is, because people don't break that easily. Why is it that Israel can oppress Palestinians for decade after decade and still accept security and acceptance? Isn't this simply too preposterous? That this is all done in the name of security when it should be obvious to everyone. Israel is a small state with a population of about 5 million, surrounded by 280 or 300 million Arabs, who are themselves surrounded by a billion and a half, almost a billion and a half Muslims. By bombing and creating all the havoc that has been caused in the last 35 years, much of it, I should add, clearly evident on non-American TV to the people who live in the area, on satellite channels who are able to, the BBC, French television, the rest of the world's television. People in that part of the world can see what is being done, can see the devastation and waste. How does that gain you security and acceptance? I don't know. It's a suicidal policy, and I have no answers for it. Take another example from the last couple of weeks. Ariel Sharon, as you may remember, laid siege to Beirut for 3 months during the summer of 1982. He and his armies killed 19,000 people during their invasion of a sovereign state, which had neither an army nor an air force to speak of, in order, he said, to destroy the PLO terrorists. Sharon is now Israel's prime minister, carefully laundered in the U.S. press of his war criminal past, routinely complimented on his restraint, and not surprisingly, he is once again besieging Palestinian towns and villages. Not a single media commentator that I have heard or read in this country has commented on the astonishing use of medieval tactics of digging trenches and moats around civilian towns and villages. Tactics, I must add, that are underwritten by American taxpayers. Who except Israel does this in the 21st century? No one. Moreover, and this is what I want to stress, in their amazingly retrograde military siege tactics against an entire population of 3 million civilians, Sharon and his armies also cut off universities, they cut off schools, they make it impossible for sick people to go through the checkpoints, which I'll show you in a minute, so that the leading Palestinian university, as an example, Birzeit, is cut off in such a way that neither students nor teachers can get to it for weeks and months at a time. As Suzanne Goldenberg writes in the London Guardian, when the army laid siege to Birzeit this month, breaking up a 400-meter strip of pavement and digging 2 trenches 3 meters deep across the road connecting the university to Ramallah, which is the biggest town nearby, 3 miles away, it was replicating a policy of containment that has unfolded over the past 6 months, penning the Palestinians into ever smaller enclosures. The trenches outside Birzeit also cut off more than 30 villages and 65,000 civilians from the commercial and political hub of West Bank life in Ramallah, and damaged phone lines and water pipes. No wonder, then, that there is beginning in Israel, and I won't have time to talk very much about it, but there is beginning in Israel a resurgence of resistance amongst Israelis to this kind of policies. So much so, as all of you know that a group of reserve officers refused service in a statement that they made on January 25th, in which they described what was taking place on the West Bank and Gaza as a war of the settlements. In other words, we're not there to defend Israel. They're saying we're there to defend the settlements, which are illegal. And I read one sentence: "We shall not continue to fight, we as Israeli soldiers who are willing to defend Israel, but we shall not," I quote, "not continue to fight beyond the 1967 borders in order to dominate, expel, blockade, assassinate, starve, and humiliate an entire people." This situation has, of course, brought forth much protest in the world from agencies and countries and observers, independent and otherwise. The UN, Mary Robinson, for example, sponsored a report to catalog the abuse of Palestinians all over the world, but not so much in the United States. The present situation is particularly bad. Palestinians are subject to the closures, the encirclement, the barricaded roads that have impeded all movement for them. You cannot move around now in any of the Palestinian territories or the West Bank and Gaza. 3 million people are prisoners. Yasser Arafat himself is not immune from the indignity of being imprisoned on the West Bank in his West Bank headquarters, where he hasn't been able to move for the last 2 months. The airport in Gaza, which was the only Palestinian port of entry in the entire Palestinian territory, otherwise you can only get to Palestine through an Israeli border, has been destroyed and bombed 3 times so that it's unusable and cannot be rebuilt in the foreseeable future. The amount of collateral damage has been enormous. The flow of goods into and out of the territories, to say nothing of workers, ordinary travelers, tourists, students, the aged and the sick. They have been immobilized, or to put it more concretely, imprisoned. According to the UN Special Coordinator's Office, in the occupied territories, Palestinian trade with Israel accounts for 80% of total trade transactions. Jordan, which is next, accounts for 3%, a very low figure, directly ascribable to Israel's control of the entire Palestinian-Jordan frontier. With Israel's closure, since Israel has simply shut all the means of in and out for Palestinians, the entire Palestinian economy has lost 3 times the amount of money taken in from donor sources during the first 6 months of the year 2000. The losses average $19.5 million per day, now over $3.5 billion. For an impoverished and colonized population dependent on the Israeli economy, thanks to the economic agreement signed by the PLO under Oslo, this is a severe hardship. There are now, estimated by the UN, about 50% unemployment and a little over 55% of Palestinians in the occupied territories living on less than $2 a day. So it's impoverishment, it's disempowerment, it's disablement, it's imprisonment in the sense of not being able to move. And all of this, as Israeli settlements on the West Bank and Gaza continue to take place, continue to be established, grow, destroy more Palestinian land. For example, 144,000 trees, Palestinian trees, have been uprooted. Thousands of acres of Palestinian agricultural land has been destroyed. When I was doing a film, if I could just tell you the story, it was very dramatic. In 1998, I was commissioned by the BBC to do a film called Return to Palestine, which was, to describe what it's like now for somebody of my age who had left when I was a boy, to see what it's like now. And we were driving along the West Bank on our way to Hebron, about which I'll show you a map of it in a second. And as we were driving along the road, I noticed on the left side of the road a few bulldozers in what seemed to be agricultural land, just plowing up the land, and a group of Palestinians, you could tell they were Palestinians because they were wearing headdress and so on, men, standing there and arguing with Israeli soldiers. So we stopped the car, we got out, and I filmed this sequence actually, although the Israeli soldiers refused to speak on camera. But what they said, and what I was summarizing in my to-the-camera remarks, was that they had come and taken this land, and that the villagers who owned the land and used it to farm were protesting. They had, of course, no way of protesting against 20 soldiers and 5 or 6 bulldozers. But they were saying, please don't do this, you're destroying our livelihood. And the soldier says, no, I'm sorry, we have to do it, it's orders. So I talked to the soldier, I said, how can you do it? He was a young man. I said, listen, how can you do this? First of all, most of these men are old enough to be your father. This is deeply cruel. You're wrecking their lives, you're taking their land. He said, it's not their land. I said, what do you mean it's not their land? They farmed it for generations. He said, this is the land of Israel. I said, look, I don't want to argue with you about the Old Testament. It may be that God gave it to you 2,000 or 5,000 or whatever number of years ago, but it's now their land, and you are dispossessing them. He said, well, maybe we're doing that, but this is what struck me as so, aside from the dehumanizing quality of the contact, it struck me as so typical of the encounter. He said, no. He said, we're doing this in the name of progress. He said, we go to the moon, we build cars, we're expanding the road. And this property, this land, is in the way of the road, so we're destroying it so that we can expand the road. I said, and that's it for you, just expanding the road, and what happens to these people and their loss of their land? He said, well, I'm sorry, that's the way it is. We have orders, and there it is again, orders, we have orders. So the settlements continue with the dispossessions and the dislocation and the theft of land, which has gone on for 35 years. Now, what of the peace process, which began in 1993 and was heralded on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993, as the major step forward? I was a critic of the peace process from the very beginning because I knew, having read the texts, that it couldn't lead anywhere, given, first of all, the tremendous imbalance in power between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the fact that the United States was on the side of the Israelis, pretty much. And the texts, which, as being somebody who reads texts and takes them seriously, had no mention in them of ending of settlement, nothing about the end of occupation, nothing about immigration or people allowed in and out, nothing about the abuse of the Palestinians. And I thought then that it was a very bad peace, and I think time has proved me right. Could we have the first map? So let me just show you what the realities are on the ground and how they evolved directly from the Oslo peace process, which was signed in 1993. Now, I don't know how many, you can't see very far back, but let me just orient you. This is the border between, sorry, I can get the microphone here. This is the border between Israel and the West Bank, running here, right? Here's Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem is here. This is the rest of Israel, supposedly. And here's Gaza, which is not contiguous, as you can see, with the West Bank. Now, the first agreement, which was made in 1994, Oslo I, gave the Palestinians some part of Gaza, the dark part, which you can see here. The light part are Israeli settlements, here, here, and of course all up and down here, all held by Israel, and basically Jericho. So according to the map, Palestinian areas given to the Palestinians in the first of the peace accords signed in 1994, 1.1% of the occupied territory. Can we have the second map now, please? Angela, second map, please. This is the second. This is the so-called tub. How does this stay on? I don't seem to be able to keep it on. You have to keep it. Okay. There's the border again. You can see it right here. And what you can see here are dark areas, which are now called Area B. Areas B. Sorry, Area A, still Palestinian areas. And this amounts to full Palestinian self-rule, 2%. Big achievement. They went from areas from 1.1 to 2.0%, and then invented this other area called Area B, which is much larger. You can hardly see Area A now because it's only 2%. And these areas are jointly administered by Israel and the Palestinians, although Israel controls security and in and out. All the rest, all this white part here, except for the dark areas, are all Israeli territory. Okay. You can see how the peace process failed and how what it ended up by doing was imprisoning the Palestinians. This is the third agreement where now Palestinian area A has now 9%. The rest is all Israeli, as you can see. So the Palestinians are always, in all of their areas are surrounded by Israeli military and settlement areas. This is 1998. So they get up to 9%, which is not a terribly great amount, as you can imagine. And Gaza remains exactly as it is, with a big settlement here, which is where all the fighting is taking place now. I mean, look how preposterous it is to have an Israeli settlement in the middle of Palestinian territory. Huge amount of territory here. all poor, all refugees, and these lovely settlements with swimming pools and lots of water, and Palestinians living in terrible conditions. Yeah, next map, please. This is now 1999. The story is pretty much the same. I don't know whether you can tell, but there's a dark area here, which is B, which is still controlled by Israel, and the Palestinian areas are the lighter shaded areas here, up there, and here. And that the total amount of Palestinian self-rule area A is only 17% of the land. 17% of the land, you can see. And the rest is all controlled by Israel. Next, please. This is 1999. And this is the situation today. Except now, I don't know how far back you can see them, but all these little blue triangles are the settlements, the Israeli settlements. So you have tiny little bits of Palestinian territory right here, dwarfed by larger bits of Israeli controlled, but also Palestinian administered, you know, like the garbage in the schools and the hospitals by the Palestinians, but the Israelis control the security, and the rest all Israeli territory, plus this metastasis of settlements, all in and out and around the land, all through, without government. Yeah. Next map, please. This is the situation today. This is now Jerusalem, a close-up of Jerusalem, which, as you know, is a tremendous bone of contention, because originally it was, this is East Jerusalem, right? Annexed conquered in 1967 and annexed later that year. You can see that the brown areas are Palestinian, and all the blue areas here are all built on big settlements, huge apartment blocks, built on Palestinian land and surrounding the smaller and smaller Palestinian area. Plus, there's been a policy of Judaization of Palestinians where 150,000 new Jewish citizens have been brought in to make East Jerusalem more Jewish than it was originally. It was an Arab section of Jerusalem. Now it's mostly Jewish. And I want to just show you one small, you can't see it, but here's a settlement of Gilo. And right across from it here is the Arab town of Beit Jala, for which there is now there's this hospital which they're asking people to give money to. Gilo was built on the land of Beit Jala, so that it's a natural thing. It's not just because these are terrorists who want to shoot at nice Israeli citizens, but that this is a Israeli settlement built on the land of this village, which has been dispossessed of its land. And you can see how this master plan of Jerusalem has made it impossible in the future, or at least that's the theory of the Israeli plans, makes it impossible for the Palestinians ever to get back without a tremendous amount of further dislocation East Jerusalem. This is called creating facts on the ground. Next slide, please. Just one more and then I'll be done. Maybe two more. Yeah. This is a map of one of the really hot spots on the West Bank. This is the town of Hebron, Al-Khalil in Arabic. It's a town of somewhere between 100 and 120,000 Arabs. You remember Baruch Goldstein, the fanatical settler doctor who came into the mosque and shot 29 people, Palestinian Muslims, as they were praying in February of 1994. As a result of that, instead of freeing the town, so to speak, the Israelis punished the Palestinians for this infraction. And the result is the most peculiar and I would say the most grotesque distortion, demographic and physical and geographical, on the whole of the West Bank. Here is the Arab town, as you can see here, 120,000 or 100,000 Palestinians. The blue areas, which amount to 20% of the city center, including the mosque and the old city, which is here, are all held by Israeli settlers what is the population of the Israeli settlers who hold 20% of the town, that is 100,000 Palestinians? 350 settlers hold this whole area, surrounded and obviously protected by Israeli troops, about 7,000 or 8,000 troops holding this. I mean, you don't need to know why there's violence and why people are protesting. This is an impossible situation, and you cannot impose order, no matter how clever or how powerful you are, as Mr. Sharon is. The last one, if I could just... And this is the actual situation today, Palestinian Bantustans in the West Bank, in which the Palestinian areas are the areas that have been surrounded by, first of all, the settlement. Well, you can't see it. It's no use my trying to explain it to you. But the brown areas are Palestinian areas, and all the others are Israelis, and the settlements are all through now. Many of them built up towns. And the result is, thank you very much. Thank you, Angela. The result is, having looked at the maps, is that the Palestinians are cooped up in nothing less than 225 ghettos from which they cannot emerge. The result is, as Amnesty testified in February of this year, February 5th, we saw both populations, Palestinians and Jews, living in fear. Every Palestinian in the occupied territories is affected in a cycle of repression, which is bringing people to despair. Israelis are living in constant fear of suicide bombs and armed attacks, which have deliberately targeted civilians, killing and wounding people in streets, shops, and bars. Trampling on people's human rights cannot be justified under any circumstances, not in the name of security and not in the name of freedom. End of quote. The delegates, I'll continue to read from this, who included a military advisor, said that the Israeli use of weapons that cause massive destruction of property, laser-guided bombs dropped by F-16 aircraft and Apache helicopter-launched air-to-ground Hellfire missiles have made Palestinians in towns constantly watch the sky in fear. In fact, on Saturday, I called a friend of mine, a widow, whose husband had just died of cancer. And I asked her what it's like. She said, well, what it's like is that every night, and of course the Israelis attack at night. It's more terrifying to be attacked at night, obviously. And they come, and she says the helicopters sit over our roofs, and we just sit there in fear. We have no place to go. Gaza houses don't have basements. So we just sit there in fear. We sit in the corridors, waiting for the bombs to fall, and nobody knows where they're going to fall or who's going to be affected. And we just sit there for hours as they sit above us, and then they bomb, and then they go away, and then they come back the next night. So this is why Amnesty says this has made Palestinians in towns constantly watch the sky in fear. Houses and infrastructure have been shelled and demolished without regard for the rules of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which not only prohibits collective punishments, but also the destruction of property, except when absolutely necessary for military operations. Delegates condemned the use of tank shells containing flechettes in the Gaza Strip. Quote, each shell may contain up to 5,000 arrows the size of nails, each one capable of killing. They are entirely inappropriate for use in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, said delegates. Such areas of Palestinians' homes, which he had visited several times over the past year, were now razed to the ground for alleged security reasons, but apparently as collective punishment, said delegates. It is unacceptable that without warning or legality, tanks and bulldozers demolish the homes of hundreds of families, including thousands of children, the organization said. Such demolitions are particularly devastating in a context in which up to 48% of the population are now out of work and relying on UN handouts. They have become, together with closures and checkpoints, part of a daily diet of harassment and humiliation for Palestinians in the occupied territories. Willful killings, inhuman treatment, and unjustified demolitions of homes are grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention, said delegates. Finally, delegates also condemned Palestinian armed attacks on Israeli civilians. The delegation visited a West Bank settlement to talk to a victim of a drive-by shooting in August 2001, Stephen Bloomberg. His wife, a nurse, has been killed. He's paralyzed. One daughter is in a wheelchair, said the delegates. The deliberate targeting of civilians can never be justified. I agree, said Amnesty International. Amnesty International delegations, including this one, have frequently visited leaders of Palestinian armed groups to condemn the targeting of civilians and urge an end to these abuses. Now, I want to conclude by saying that it is quite clear that we are at a dead end. There is now a stalemate that will lead nowhere if it continues, except to more killing and more violence, and for Palestinians, more loss. They are the ones who have lost the most since the wound of 1948 was opened. Therefore, I and many others, on the Israeli side as well, the left has finally, the so-called left, or the peace camp, the reservists, the writers, the intellectuals, and others in Israel have finally been awakened to the ruinous policy of their government. And so many of us, including the Ta'ayush group, which is an Israeli group, the Committee Against the Demolition of Houses, an Israeli group, many of the Israeli historians, many writers, intellectuals, musicians like Barenboim, and others, are calling, therefore, for the end of the occupation and that the withdrawal of Israeli troops and settlers from the territory occupied on June the 5th, 1967, begin immediately. There are UN resolutions which specify very, very, very precisely, signed on to and affirmed by the United States, resolutions 242 and 337, which say, or 338, I'm sorry, that say that no territory acquired by force or by conquest can be kept. It has to be returned. I think many of us also feel that we need international monitors, and the Europeans, very much to their credit, have been in the forefront of this movement. And that should go hand in hand with a new set of elections for Palestinians. That is to say, we need the re-empowerment of Palestinian civilians who have been imprisoned and under occupation to reassert their democratic rights to civility and equality, and to demonstrate their capacity for ruling themselves. The idea being that a Palestinian state from which Israelis have been withdrawn, both military and settlers, could exist side by side with Israel, and the two states, as sovereign states, with an equality of purpose, together negotiate some sort of peace settlement, not forgetting, and I conclude on this note, that there still remain roughly 4 million Palestinian refugees who live in places like Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and elsewhere as stateless people, that their fate has to be determined. It cannot be simply brushed under the table and forgotten. Just as what Jews suffered in World War II and the depredations of anti-Semitism through the ages must not and is not being forgotten, so too the terrors and injustices that Palestinians have suffered cannot be forgotten and simply swept away and be told, go away and go and live without restitution and remain dispossessed. So what I'm arguing for is something that is, I think, beginning to emerge at a level that is, in Israel at least, hopeful. And what I urge for us to do as American citizens who are deeply involved, whether we know it or not, by virtue of the fact that we spend a tremendous amount, $5 billion of our money as taxpayers, in and on Israel, that we begin to start thinking about where our policy has led and how much responsibility we have for it, which is a great deal of responsibility, and start vocally and through organizations such as the universities and churches and other organizations of civil society in this country to begin to address the imbalance. I think, finally, it is absolutely central to the present disquiet that exists between the West and the Islamic world. Whether one likes it or not, for Muslims, for Arabs, the question of Palestine is the central question. And the injustice done to the Palestinians and the obvious partisanship of the United States for Israel and its obdurate refusal to attend seriously to seriously, I don't mean in a formula, seriously to the Palestinian narrative, its claims on our attention and our moral support, have contributed a great deal to the tension that we are living through and will continue to live through for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
You didn't address the issues of the Palestinian
were within. I'm sorry, I should have spoken about them. It's a very important part of the population of Palestinians. There are roughly, as I said, 1 million Palestinians who are the descendants of the people who were not kicked out in 48 but remained. They now constitute about 20%, well, between 18 and 20% is the figure I rely on, of the population of Israel. Until 1966, I would say between 1948 and 1968, they were ruled separately as an alien enemy population, and they were ruled under emergency defense regulations. They were not allowed to go out of their villages without express military permission. They were not given full civic and political and economic rights. They were supervised by and given terrible punishments if they infracted any of these laws, these emergency defense regulations, which were taken over by the British until 1966. After 1966, these laws were rescinded and they are treated as citizens of the State of Israel, and yet their situation is deeply anomalous and has a lot to do with this thought that I find, or this practice that I find deeply unattractive. Because they are not Jews, although they are citizens of Israel, they are not recognized as a national minority, which of course they are. They are Arabs, but they are not Jews. They are citizens, but they don't have all the rights of other citizens, the Jewish citizens of Israel. Statistically and juridically, they are referred to only as non-Jews. They are not allowed the same rights with regard to land the Jews are. That is to say, 92% of the land of Israel is held in trust for the Jewish people in perpetuity by the Jewish agency, the land agency. Arabs are not allowed to buy, lease, or rent land from the Jewish agency. They live in restricted areas. Periodically, their land is taken from them. All the land of the Palestinians who were driven out in 1948, by 1949, 1950, had been declared Israeli land, and this became the land of the Jewish people. Israel is unique in two respects, maybe three respects. It is the only state in the world that has never declared its borders, has never said where its borders are. And one of the aims of a peace agreement would be for Israel to declare these are our borders. Second, Israel is anomalous in another respect. It's the only state in the world that is not the state of its citizens, but the state of the Jewish people wherever they are. So that if you're Jewish and you live in America, or you live in Venezuela, or you live in Russia, or you live in Ethiopia, you are entitled, according to the law of return, to go to Israel and become an Israeli citizen, no question asked, so long as you're the child of a Jewish mother. Palestinians, like myself, who were born in Palestine, don't have the same right. So Palestinians don't have the right of immigration. And Palestinians don't serve in the Israeli army, and therefore are excluded. So the question of a Jewish state and a democracy is really, in a sense, an anomaly. It's a contradiction, because if you're not Jewish, you can't participate in the democracy to the same extent. The budgetary restraints on Arab villages and towns are much greater. They get roughly 10% of the, or less, even 5% of the budget that is given to Jewish towns. They're not given the same opportunities in employment and education that Jews are. So that even if there's an agreement between Palestinians and Israelis on the West Bank and Gaza, there remains the problem for Israel of the Israeli Palestinians, who are, as I say, an anomalous population, who have no interest at all in leaving and becoming part of a West Bank state. So something has to be done about their status as a national minority and the exact status of their citizenship. Moreover, I think it's important to remember, and in this I've met with Israelis, with jurists and activists. Israel does not have a constitution, which explains the increasingly powerful role of the rabbinate, of the Orthodox and, let us say, Jewish authorities on the state, and thereby the increasing religious pressure to conform by Jewish authorities on, let's say, many secular Jews, and certainly, of course, on Arabs. So I think that's an important battle for the future and for the future of democracy. Just as for Palestinians, when and if there will be, and I'm sure there will be, a Palestinian state, one of our main objects is to create a democracy with elections of the kind that we're now calling for, many of us who are secular and don't really subscribe to what is in effect a minority view, which is Islamic and sectarian in that sense.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So are you opposed to the concept of a Jewish state altogether, or to the way that Israel is?
No, I'm not opposed to the. I'm suspicious of the idea of any kind of state that thinks of itself as homogeneous when in fact it isn't. What people as groups do themselves is entirely up to them. I believe in self-determination for Jews as for others, so long as that self-determination doesn't infringe on the rights of others. My main complaint about Israel has been what it's done to the Palestinians, not ipso facto that it is a Jewish state. I'm not at liberty to say, just as I feel very strongly that Sharon has no right to determine whether Arafat is the president of Palestine or not. He happens to not like him, he wants to remove him. I don't think it's my job to remove Sharon from the president or the prime ministership, the premiership of Israel. That's something for Israelis to determine. But I think the problem with Israel is some of the issues I've been raising tonight. That is to say, what do you do about this national minority, which is not even mentioned in the laws of Israel as a national minority? What do you do about people who are not Jews, who are members of the state? Who are citizens of the state but don't have the same rights as others. And this is why I should say it here, this is why I firmly believe that although it's important as a first step that there be two states, my hope is, given the tiny geography we're talking about, that in the end it'll be one state with two different peoples with their own law. I mean, the Swiss have done it. The Belgians, with all kinds of problems, have done it too. That it's possible to have a multinational state or a binational state or a plurinational state with a multi-confessional population. I mean, human ingenuity is capable of that, in which no one feels that his or her right is being infringed to practice religion, to meet and associate and to form parties on the basis of any acceptable social norm. But I think what has to be kept in mind for the area we're talking about, and that's why I started by talking about Palestinian history, is that the history of the area is itself mixed. And I think the model of partition, which has been very influential in the post-colonial period, whether it's in Ireland or India or Cyprus or former Yugoslavia, has not worked. It's simply, it doesn't, I mean, people have to live together in other ways, creatively, than just to divide off and say, this is Jewish, this is Palestinian, this is Northern, this is Southern, this is Protestant, this is Catholic. Those are draconian measures which work up to a point, but they're legacies of the imperial world, and Palestine is too. The British followed the same policy that they did in England, in India. In fact, the man who was the architect of the partition plan that divided India and Pakistan in 1947 was the same man who designed a similar partition for Palestine in the late 40s afterwards. I forget his name, Reginald Copeland, his name was. So this idea of divide and quit has not worked, and which the British have left us with. And I'm an idealist, you might say. That is to say, I think that there are more interesting ways than to cordon oneself off in a what appears to be, but is obviously a fictional, homogeneous entity. And I take the same view of all states, I have to say, not just the Jewish state. I mean, the idea of a purely German state or a purely Italian state, I mean, simply belied by the facts. The post-World War II world, the post-colonial world, is too mixed a place for us to be saddled with, in my opinion, antiquated and anachronistic policies of separation and a fictional homogenization, which simply has produced more problems than it's solved. So I feel very strongly about this on philosophical grounds, but on the other hand, I also feel that if people, and Jews have a particular claim on this, I mean, have suffered a tremendous history of persecution and anti-Semitism for the fact that they were Jews, then it's obviously right to say that they can do what they want in terms of how they want to lead their lives. But at the same time, it can't be at the expense of another people, which it has been so far in Israel. So I think one has to look beyond histories of suffering and victimization to something that is more in keeping, I think, with human dignity and the full development of human capacities, which include tolerance of the other. And I think America can be a great model for this, although, theoretically I think it is. But one can look to the past. I mean, one could look to, Islamic Spain as another model of how Jews and Muslims, I should say, well, Arabs, yes, and Catholics, although it's always the Christians who cause the problem. And I myself, I come from a Christian background, so I'm not ashamed to admit mea culpa,
Yes.
Where are we?
Right in the middle there.
Oh, yeah, you want this. Repeat the question.
Go ahead. Yeah, you. I don't know your name, but
No, I
Just a
can't
little
hear you. Louder.
It's often repeated in our government that you can't give in to terrorism, and that will allow terrorism to become a viable sort of way to deal with international politics.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering what you think, what sort of symbolic gesture would be appropriate in this situation in order to counter that effect.
Can you repeat the question?
the question is that sometimes people have said that terrorism should not be tolerated, and if you can't give in to terrorism, and what would your response to that be?
Well, look, it's not about sort of macho positions and what you give into and what you don't give into. My problem from the beginning has been the narrowness of the definition of terrorism that the United States has pursued, which is essentially, non-state terrorism, such as that of the Qaeda or Bin Laden model, or what exists in the Philippines or Somalia and so on. Whereas I think terrorism is across the board. It's not just a few non-state actors, but there is something called state terrorism. I mean, we know that's been the case in Indonesia by the Indonesian government. What it did in East Timor. We know it was the case historically, in Algeria under the French. I mean, of course, the French use the same words that the Israelis and the Americans use today. They call the Algerian resistance, the FLN, they refer to it as terrorism. And the Israelis have done that steadily since the middle of the 1970s. And it's been traced by an Israeli journalist called Amnon Kapeliuk. He traced it to a debate in the Foreign Office, in the Foreign Ministry in Israel, that from henceforth all Palestinian acts of resistance were to be described as terrorism. Well, when you have that, and you have a major state like the United States more or less repeating the same line, without discriminating the situation, without discriminating the actors and the fact that states can take part in terrorism, I think the bombing of villages by F-16s is an act of state terrorism, and I think that should be labeled as such. So rather than say, well, we don't want to give in to terrorism, I think it's important that we discriminate different kinds of terrorism and take the same position against all of them, if that's our position. And I think it's done us a tremendous amount of harm throughout the world, us as Americans, that we point out the terrorism of Bin Laden, which is terrorism. I have no problem with describing it as such. And what occurred on September the 11th also is terrorism, right? But we also have to put it in a context where other forms of terrorism are included, not somehow excluded and left to just, to go on, more or less, just because they happen to be on our side. Second, I think that in this country we have a long tradition of demonizing an outside devil, and terrorism has become our new one. And I think that's it's a very sort of dangerous practice, but it's a way of militarizing what in fact is in many cases, civil disputes in foreign theaters. I mean, what is going on between the Palestinians and Israelis is not simply a matter of terrorism, as Sharon keeps repeating, and Bush seems to echo, and he admires Sharon for that reason. It's actually a dispute between two peoples, which cannot be reduced simply to terrorism. Yes, terrorism in its simplest form is an act of physical harm and terror against civilians for political ends. But if you take in all those instances, it certainly has to include the use of Apache helicopters and gunships against defenseless civilians. That has the same structure as the terrorism that has been used, by suicide bombers. It's the same idea, I think, where innocent people or people not directly involved in conflict are targeted for political reasons. In this case, in the case of what happens to Palestinians in towns in Gaza and Rafah and Deir al-Balah and refugee camps. Imagine the idea of bombing a refugee camp. I mean, what could be more terrorist than that? These are refugees who have already been uprooted from their homes and live in smaller homes and hovels in most instances that are destroyed by helicopters. How brave do you have to be when you know they don't have missiles, they don't have stingers, they don't have any way of attacking a helicopter which is sitting on top of your house and then can do whatever it wants with smart bombs? That's, in my opinion, that's terrorism. That's reprehensible. Or if it isn't terrorism, we have to have a word for it that's equally condemnatory. So I prefer not to use the macho terms of, we're not going to toughen up, we're not going to, the things that now all of them use. Our leaders like Rumsfeld and, don't get me started on that. Maybe one more question.
What? We're going to have just one more question. Yeah, you right there, huh? Louder?
Well, look, I tell you the honest truth. I myself am not a pacifist. I have to say that at the outset. I mean, I'm married to a Quaker, but I myself am not a Quaker. On the other hand, I've grown up, forgive me if I'm a little autobiographical for a second. I mean, I've grown up literally all of my life in contexts of violence. When I was growing up, it was, the first, of course, what we used to refer to as the Jews before 1948, the Haganah versus the Palestinians, and the British Army was there, all around me as I grew up. I went to colonial schools. The British were there forcibly. And then when I was at school in Egypt, for most of my schooling, also the British, and there was a situation of violence. And I remember the bombings and, you'd come home and you'd wonder who was killed next and what has disappeared. And then, when I was 12 years old, the whole world changed for me. Palestine ceased to exist. It became Israel. And my whole family, my extended family, were made, all of them refugees in 1948. My own family, my parents and my sisters and myself, we were living in Egypt, so we didn't have the terrible shock. But for all the rest, I don't have it. After the spring of '48, I didn't have a single member of my family, which was all in Palestine, remain there. They were driven out because they were unarmed and defenseless. And then there were the periods of the various Arab-Israeli wars where I was the only member of my family here, so they were all there during the Suez War of 1956, the '73 war. The Lebanese Civil War, where people were killed, right around the corner. So it's an ugly thing, and my sense of it, I'll give you another example. I mean, the Lebanese Civil War, which ran for 15 years, 150,000 people were killed, right? And then they had a big conference in Saudi Arabia, and they settled the war, and what did they agree on? What they had before the Civil War. Nothing was changed. So I myself, to come round and be contradictory, is I don't believe in violence. I think it doesn't lead to anything except more violence. It's a cliche, but I think it's literally true. On the other hand, I don't believe in simply lying down and playing dead, but there are more. I learned this from my guru and teacher. He was one of my two greatest friends, Iqbal Ahmad, who would say that a real revolutionary and liberationist strategy is never confined to violence. It has to be more civil than it is military. And, you know, what you have to do is to be able to out-organize your enemy. And that's what Palestinians are now doing on the West Bank. It's not the Hamas bombers that really are making the most difference. It's the fact that Palestinian civil society is not breaking. This is what has defied Sharon, of which another symbol are the people who infiltrate and blow up settlements and so on and so forth. But what really has befuddled him, and what he cannot understand, and the military mind doesn't understand, that civil society, schools, even though it's impossible to get to school, you have schools in your backyard. You can't get to the hospital, you improvise a field hospital. You can move around. They put up barricades, you go around them. You sneak, you dig tunnels. That kind of thing is much more creative and much more liberating than arming more people and sending them out to fight. But I think, at the same time, it's important to put up resistance if you can. The problem with Palestinians now, as it was with Afghanistan, is that there is such an asymmetry. These are asymmetrical conflicts. I mean, what did the Afghanistan... I mean, I was always opposed, and still am opposed to the Taliban. But if you think of the structure of the war, what did they have to oppose B-52 bombings at 40,000 feet? Nothing. They have no missiles, no anti-aircraft, no radar, no defenses. So we literally destroyed the country. Now, people argue that it was a just war. But it would have been just as just for the Taliban or whoever was in power at the time to fight back in some way that they can't fight back. Same with the Palestinians. There's no way they can really fight back. All they have are a few machine guns, light machine guns at that. They can't oppose a tank. But just the other day, last week, for the first time, the Israelis are worried. Their best tank, which is the Merkava tank, you know, which is a 58 or 60-ton monster, was destroyed by 3 Palestinians who set a bomb underneath it, obviously, and now they're studying what they did. Of course, you could always find means to oppose violence with other kinds of violence. But I think what has to, I want this to be my last thought, if it could be called a thought, that what is going to win in the end is the idea that you're fighting for. And if you're fighting for, you know, another ethnic state, another Bantustan or another ghetto, that's not going to carry people very far. But if, as I've always argued, if, as I say, the Palestinian idea at its very core is an idea of coexistence and tolerance and somehow understanding and acceptance of the other is what you're fighting for, then, I mean, I think you have a much more complicated, as Gramsci says, the battle of ideas and of war of maneuver is much more interesting than the battle of fixed positions. Because in our case, there are no fixed positions. Palestinians don't have an army, don't have an air force. You can't fight. You have to fight on another level. And it needn't always be violence and arms. It could be ideas. It could be culture. It could be, as I've advocated many times, you know, trying to find Israeli groups who are willing to stand with you, or finding at the barricades, you know, at the blockades where you can't move. One of my friends in Palestine has organized a non-violent observer group, 400 or 500 Europeans, never written about in the press here, who come to Palestine and go with Palestinians who are trying to get to school at the blockades, try to push their way through, unarmed, of course. Soldiers who are opposing them, and just by sheer numbers, just overwhelming. Okay, they go and put up an even stronger barricade with bigger concrete. But the idea is what counts. And I think it's very important to talk to many Israelis. I do that all the time. Talk to them and say, listen, where are you going? This is suicidal. I mean, that's much more powerful. Saying, we want to live here with you, but you can't do it by laying up more hatred and revenge in the hearts of people whom you humiliate. And that's why it's so important that these reservists, these soldiers that I refer to, the officers, they're now, you know, 1,000 of them. The number increases all the time. That's a very important element to engage with. But that can't be done by force of arms. It has to be done by ideas and by creative thinking that leaps over boundaries and crosses barricades. I think that's the only hope. And that is more accommodating to diversity. You know, you don't, I mean, I can take it from me. There's nothing more uninteresting than being locked up with your own kind all the time. It's much better. Really, I'm serious. I mean, that's what's so interesting about the United States. It was just made up of, no offense to anybody here, of white, you know, wasps and so on. I mean, you know, forget it. And that's where American values are, in that kind of thing, in diversity, in sharing, in tolerance, in engaging in argument with, yes, of course. But rather than homogeneity, because homogeneity is a fiction. I mean, how do I know, for example, that if you go back 3 generations that my family wasn't Bulgarian, or who knows who came through Palestine 150 years ago? My father was born in something called Jerusalem, Syria. He was a part of the Ottoman Empire. He was born in 1895. And he came to America. Why? Because he was about to be drafted to fight in the Turkish army in Bulgaria. He said, I don't want any of that. He came here, and what did he do? He ended up by fighting in the American army in France. I mean, that's more of the reality, I think.
Well, thank you very much.